Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon. And today we have an excellent guest. He is the author of The Populist Delusion, Prophets of Doom, and other works. And he runs the very successful and very interesting YouTube channel, Academic Agent. So it is, of course, Mr. Academic Agent. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Nick.
I said Academic Agent twice there because I didn't know how to do the intro. I practiced that all night and then fluffed it. But yeah, you have a very very interesting YouTube channel, which I think probably a lot of our audience will know. Not everyone will know, so I'll just sort of give them a bit of an intro. Well, let's just start with this. Actually, one big theme on your YouTube channel lately is the idea of putting the woke away, which I think is going to be
Mhm.
very interesting to our audience. So this is a bet you have with Oron McIntyre that by I believe May 2025 that the regime will kind of put the woke away, which actually means it's a quite limited claim that they'll kind of superficially dial back some of the more egregious excesses of wokeness, like the
Yes,
constant racial identity politics, and they'll return to the kind of 90s colorblind ideal, which you call back to Fresh Prince, which is a kind
yes,
of perfect reference for people of my age. But fundamentally, key point is it won't actually tackle any of the serious underlying problems like immigration. And this kind of made sense to me because sometimes I'll be very bullish on woke, and I'll be doing like a live show for my other podcast, Weekly Skeptic, and I'll say, yeah, we're going to beat this woke thing. DEI is falling apart. It's all crumbling. And then I'll go and post an X post saying that everything's over. We have no legal system, no police, no culture, no religion. I got like 10,000 likes for a post like that the other day, and it was pure doomerism. And so it's like, how can both of these exist? And this kind of made sense to me that, oh, it's because they're only putting it away in a superficial sense. But anyway, I don't want to ramble on too much. Could you explain more on that?
yeah. I mean, the but there's a number of things behind this idea. The first thing is that whatever the original idea of putting what people call woke front and center, woke ideology front and center, whatever the original idea for that was, has clearly failed. I mean, as a ruling ideology, it is uniquely bad. I would say it it doesn't persuade people. It turns people against them. It creates, in the friend enemy distinction, it makes people enemies. And the more aggressive and the more hostile and in your face woke gets, the more people instinctively push back against it, right? It is much more kind of convincing and persuasive to say, Nick, you're a nice guy. You're not a racist. You have no problem with people of other ethnic backgrounds, and also, just like Uncle Phil from Fresh Prince, you can recognize that somebody like that is just like you and just like me and just like everyone else. Basically, everybody's the same, right? And all races is skin deep. That was the messaging that you and me would have grown up with, watching shows like that, and pretty much all through the 80s and the 90s. Whereas the messaging now is, because you're a white man, you are racist, sexist, heteronormative, homophobic, and it doesn't even matter what you say or do, because these things are almost kind of byproducts of just your being in the world, if you want to put it that way. Um, they're implicit, they're covert, they're hidden in microaggressions and things like this. So basically, there's no real comeback to that other than you need to sit down and shut up. And that was basically what they told us in 2017, in 2018, in 2020. Do you remember that book, White Fragility, by Robin DiAngelo? Right, that was 4 years ago now. Um, and I think this is bad messaging. I think it turns people against them and makes people want to vote for a figure like Donald Trump. Okay. And increasingly, we're seeing that not only does it turn off the white population uh, against them, who we call the regime, it also is increasingly turning ethnic minorities against them too. I mean, I think Donald Trump is on course to win the highest number of black voters of any Republican ever, and he's just launched a, an, a quite incredible range of shiny golden sneakers directly, which sold out in minutes, right? Among that community. So that's one problem that the regime have caused, that woke causes for the regime. It turns people against them, and it makes people check out of the institutions. They lose trust with journalists. They lose trust with politicians. They lose trust with the legal system. That they just don't trust their institutions like they did, let's say, even 20 years ago. Let's say, like, peak Tony Blair era, there may have been a few murmurings of discontent somewhere in the shires, but generally most of the population was, um, bought into some idea of a shared society. And possibly the high point of this that I will take everybody back to was the London Olympics in 2012. I mean, I remember I was there. I remember David Beckham going down the Thames and lighting the torch, and the Mobot and all that sort of stuff. And it felt like, okay, the country's together. It maybe looks a little bit different, but basically we're all on the same page here. And all of that in the space of 12, 12 years has basically been obliterated by this woke ideology. So that's one driver, Nick, that I think that maybe not everybody in the so-called elites recognizes, but I think a certain class, what people think of as the Davos class, or maybe even Tony Blair himself, they're not like stupid people. They may recognize that they're losing the population, which a ruling class cannot do. Um, the second key thing is something that, if you've picked up a Daily Telegraph in the past month, you've been bashed over the head with, which is that the military is struggling to recruit, especially among white men who are the traditional bread and butter of the armed forces in this country and in America. And well, surprise, surprise, you keep on telling these people that they're evil over and over again, and and they don't want to fight for you. So that's the second major problem. And there are others as well. Another one is actually has been revealed or has been exacerbated by the conflict in Israel since the Hamas attack. The comedian David Baddiel wrote a book before that even happened called "Jews Don't Count," and really he was taking aim at the Corbynistas and the problems on the left, i.e., what they call left-wing anti-Semitism. And I think that that is causing some part of realignment as well, because especially in America, a lot of the big pro-Israel backers, are starting to realize that this is something Douglas Murray talks about whenever whenever he's on camera now. So there's an angle there as well. And I'm just trying to think of what the fourth one was. There's a fourth one too, but maybe my memory will be jogged.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I might be able to think of it because I've watched your video on this as well. But yeah, so many things. I mean, Robin DiAngelo, by the way, I think it might have been you was posting the other day that where's she gone? She actually popped up the other day to complain about Michelangelo's creation of Adam. She said, Why are they both white? He's like God, and he's there with David or something. It's Adam. It's actually literally called Adamo, but she thought it was David. And then she goes, they're both white. So she popped up to complain about great art and say that it was too white. So yeah, particularly sort of toxic figure. But my question there is, you say how it's a uniquely bad ideology for the ruling class to adopt. Is why did they do it? Did they think that, okay, this will just be a harmless sop to the sort of plebs? But then did they realize, like following, for example, Occupy Wall Street, maybe they thought, oh, this will kind of appease the masses and make them think that they're winning or doing something. This is one of my little theories. But then
Mhm.
but then they realized it actually cost money. It was a cost for their shareholders, and it was maybe too socially divisive. What do you think the change was?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. I do think the threat of the radical left, um, especially in their kind of anti 1% Occupy Wall Street mode, may have caused some alarm. And I'm sure you've all seen those graphs about instances of the word racism since 2008, or talking about white privilege or whatever. They were able basically to reorient the old fashioned left from talking about ownership of the means of production and workers' rights and things like that, to essentially getting most of the left to cheer on massive corporations. I mean, you've all seen the meme of you know the rebel against the system with the entire kind of woke corporate complex behind them. Um,
The
so
resistance
so
and
so you now have the bizarre scenario where the foreign policy of a well-known left-wing figure like Vaush. I don't know if people are aware of him. I never watch him, by the way, but I'm aware of him. But if you actually look at his policy preferences, they're identical to George W. Bush. I mean, that is incredible achievement. So the first real achievement of the regime was their containment of the left. Like the old-fashioned, real kind of radical Marxist left, by uh, you know basically getting them to focus on culture war nonsense rather than taking on the bankers and so on. Um, that did get a resurgence under Jeremy Corbyn, whose manifesto from 2017 looks kind of wild now. Do you remember when he pledged to nationalize the banks
oh
in
yeah,
in London? I mean, that is.
broadband was a human right and all that stuff.
I mean, I do feel, in retrospect, that had Corbyn actually managed to get into number 10, they probably would have taken him out. I don't think that is much of a just for security concerns alone. I'm sure, but so that was one driver. But I do think, Nick, that there are other longer standing reasons why woke emerged as an ideology, which really goes back to 1960s civil rights legislation and the formalization of things that were already happening, backed by civil rights law. In this country, by the way, we had our you'd have to look into the specific laws, but there's a mirror set of laws that came in the mid 60s here as well, um, almost at the same time, or maybe just a bit before, when they passed the Civil Rights Act in America. There was a whole raft of liberalization bills that came in here as well. Um, Peter Hitchens is very good on that. If you read his book, he's got a book called Abolition of Britain, and there's the Abolition of Liberty, also known as the Brief History of Crime, where he basically goes into the harmonization of US and UK legislation. Um, I think that was when it was formalized in law that you cannot discriminate. For example, you can't have what they called it, prejudice back then, but you're not allowed basically to not hire someone on the basis of their racial background and so on. So you can see why something like woke would emerge downstream, if you want, from the laws that are already on the books. Um, the problem is that it was one thing to have that under the hood while telling people, the Fresh Prince messaging. It was another thing to become like openly aggressive and hostile. Um, and In a way, I think they've created problems that didn't even exist. I actually think that it's probably true that there are more people are quote unquote racist now than they were 20 years ago, because the repeated kind of bashing over the head has actually then made people start looking more closely at all of this sort of thing, and well, they've drawn their own conclusions. I'll just put it that way. So yeah, so
Yeah,
a long answer, but there are two routes in. One was the short term Occupy Wall Street thing, but there is also the longer term formalization of laws already on the books. Yeah.
yeah. Well, on the final point you made about race, I mean, at very least, they've made sort of white people aware of themselves as a racial group, which is quite a strange choice. In countries where it was largely white people just basically didn't think of themselves as a race at all. They just thought themselves as a default, and that might be called a sort of white privilege. But now they think of themselves, oh, we're a group. We're told repeatedly two things: one, you are a specific group, and two, you're evil. So the only response to that, it seems to me, is one, the kind of craven capitulation of the kind of, oh, we are terrible class, or to go sort of f off, which is we see a lot of that now as well. So that's a very strange decision. And yeah, and so you cite it with laws because some people say no, it's French postmodernist thought, and some people say no, no, it's other factors. So yeah, you're one of these people says it's more the civil rights movement and so on, and the laws that were therein. But one
Hmm.
question I have, I've got loads of questions, but one is, how will it be done? This putting the woke away, because presumably amongst the regime, some want it, some don't. You know, it's made up of people. They're not totally organized. They're more organized than the masses, which we can get into later on elite theory, but they're not totally presumably organized or one mind. So how will this actually transpire? Is it things like what we've already seen from Bill Ackman, let's say strongly discouraging his chosen political candidate, I think Dean Phillips, to
Hmm.
have DEI on his website by saying, by the way, I'm giving you a $1 million donation, and let's just see if you change your mind about. He put out this amazing post. He said, let's just see what Dean does now that he's educated himself, and I've given him a million brackets, and I've given him
Hmm.
$1 million. So that was pretty funny. But is it that kind of thing that will happen?
Yeah, no, I think one of the hidden stories of last year really was that there was a massive purging of the DEI teams in corporate America and well in the corporate world in general. I think from 2021 to 2023 there was something like an 85% reduction in DEI programs and things. Um, a lot of those things were instituted in the first place reactively to the George Floyd uh, peaceful protests, right? And they all wanted to be seen to do something, but as soon as uh, as soon as they got the idea that it was starting to affect things, morale, bottom line, whatever it happens to be, they've basically backslid on all of those things to the extent where these sorts of people. I'm sure Robin D'Angelo's not looking for work, but a lot of the kind of lesser well-known diversity training people were struggling to find work. I mean, somebody told me it's Black History Month or something. Seems like it's always Black History Month, but the very fact that you barely even notice anymore is a big change, I think, from even a couple of years ago. One of the things that interests me, Nick, actually, is that not everybody agrees with this. And I put a poll up earlier on Twitter, just asking people, do you think we're past peak woke now, or do you think it's accelerating? And majority of people, 58% last I saw, actually think woke is getting worse rather than dialing down, which is not what I'm seeing at all. I think that it's already massively dialed down from where it was even 2 years ago. I think the Bud Light thing really maybe put the willies up a lot of the corporations and even the U.S. military. I don't know if you remember, back in 2021, they had an ad campaign called "The Calling," which was literally kind of, you know, hello, I'm an ethnic lesbian. The military is a great place for me to kind of self actualize and all this sort of stuff. Um, whereas the last ad that I saw the US military put out was literally a helicopter full of an all white male crew, ready to kind of, you know, give their lives in the duty of Uncle Sam or whatever. So, I mean, I feel like part of it is driven by actual realities. Um, so that then makes me wonder, well, why is it the perception of most of my followers, most of whom will be somewhere on the quote unquote right, why is it that their perception is that it is increasing? And this is where I'll say, I mean, sorry to say, Nick, but I think it's possibly because of outlets like GB News and my friend Carl at the Lotus Eaters and Fox News and all of these outlets basically who uh, talk about woke 24/7 and accounts like Libs of TikTok. If you talk about woke 24/7, it will feel like it is ever increasing, right? It will feel like the line is always going up. Um, Whereas if you pay attention to what the mainstream press and the corporates and what they're actually saying at Davos, there was a well circulated clip of uh, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, talking at Davos a couple of weeks back. basically saying that Donald Trump was right about a whole bunch of things. Um, you'll you know it it's subtle, but it's not that subtle. It's not really that subtle if you're just going to read. And I feel like, in a strange way, the incentives are now a little bit misaligned, where a lot of people, for various different reasons, are incentivized to generate kind of outrage clicks looking at transsexuals or whatever. Whereas in fact the powers that be, who remember are masters of this, they're masters of being in control and they're masters of power, have already spotted what they need to do, and they've already kind of recognized that this is not working out that well. And frankly, if they're going to be in a cold war or even a hot war with Russia, Iran, and China, they need to dial it down, because we could be in World War III, and we can't really be talking about men in dresses. If you're fighting the Russians, that's the cold reality of it. So that's my view, but people are free to disagree, as many of them do.
Yeah. Well, that advert, many of us noted, oh, they need people to fight wars again. They need the white working class back to fight the wars again. Yeah, many of us noted. Absolutely agree on that. On the woke poll, my theory would be probably they don't understand your limited definition of it. They probably see a general atmosphere. Yes, it might be because of outlets like GB and so on. They probably see a general atmosphere, immigration. They're probably tying a number of things together that perhaps aren't strictly woke. And then that would be my guess, responding to your poll, that you're
Mhm,
thinking of a more limited definition of actually look at DEI, look at Back to Fresh Prince, whereas they're just thinking we sort of are in a general woke atmosphere of trans issue and so many other issues. That's probably why they think it's accelerating still, because they haven't really passed it out. That would be my guess in the way
mhm,
that you have. Just to answer the charge of GB, and yeah, I do feel that. I mean, GB News is just my day job, so they give me the stories. I have to talk about them. I do think, are we doing yet another trans story? Weekly Skeptic, I control the stories, and there I do also talk about it. So guilty as charged. Really, come from comedy. I'm just a song and dance man, really. So I'm just responding. It's a normal thing to respond to the culture as a sort of comedian and just mock it. But I do understand your point that from a sort of more tactical point of view, I am sort of guilty as charged there, that we should just stop mentioning it and just not acknowledge it would be probably a stronger tactic, and have our
mhm,
own kind of proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. I do accept that. Um, and but just on these points, you also say elsewhere that the regime is happy with a certain level of culture war back and forth.
mhm.
They're putting the woke away, but they want a certain amount of. They seem to like. We see certain channels do quite well that are fairly centrist and just sort of, or maybe even GB or certain YouTube channels. They
Mhm.
they just sort of they just sort of churn this culture war mill, and actually the regime's pretty comfortable with that.
Yeah, because you've got to remember what it is that is what would be genuinely alarming for the regime versus what they can kind of deal with, right? They can deal with culture wars. They're happy with that. The Republican Party in America is happy to dine out on that. I mean, do you remember when the Bud Light thing happened? How many senators came out and said, "I'm throwing out all my Bud Light." I mean, it's just such like a cost-free, easy kind of crowd-pleasing thing. And the same here, really. Albeit to a slightly lesser extent, because in America they have Trump, who is the kind of poll star, whereas in this country we kind of lack a figure like that. Really, I mean, Farage is there, but Farage doesn't have the big structure behind him that Trump has managed to do, and it's a quirk really of how good the Tories are at this containment lark, that they managed to keep Farage from becoming a Trump-like figure here. Um, but yeah, what would really scare them, though, I think, would be what we discussed before. It would be a kind of white collectivism, where people start to organize around ethnic interest in that sort of way, right? I would say that would be a kind of doomsday for the regime, and that would be the one thing that the entire system is warded to mitigate against, if that makes any sense. I mean, there are other things. I mean, militant Islam is another assimilable thing that the regime ultimately will not brook. Um, Although, as we've seen with recent debates, they have actually been a bit more organised. The uh, that particular group, so there's maybe more defences for them within the system. Whereas there would be there's no real cover for the first idea, which is any form of white collectivism. That is the ultimate evil, basically, because it's seen as fascist or Nazi or whatever. So, as long as you're talking about, you know, men interests or whatever else, yeah, okay, I mean, you may upset Owen Jones or whatever, but ultimately they're going to give you a kind of longer leash to talk about that sort of stuff. It's,
Do you think? Yeah. On that question of, I mean, since World War II, of course, that's been everyone's biggest fear, the regime's biggest fear. But anything to do with white people means you're Hitler, basically.
yes.
But why would they even? Why would they attack white people so relentlessly in this way? Isn't the absolutely obvious outcome of that white people will start to think, hang on, why are people against us, and we need to stick together? I mean, that's so predictable that you're tempted to think they deliberately did it, or do you think
Hmm.
that's conspiratorial? I mean, because it's so obvious.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know because I mean, not every element, like clearly, not every element within what we call the regime is rational, right? Or they don't always do things thinking of the long term consequences because everything is so on such a short planning time horizon. If that makes any sense. I mean, just think of how our political class deal with every issue. They're never thinking of 20 years time. They're always thinking of like the next news cycle ahead of them. So in a strange way, you can get crazy things happening, spiraling out of control like this. Um, but I mean, I have a view that there are many layers of defense that are kind of put there to stop that happening, right? I mean, let's just say it. Layer number one: what has Jordan Peterson been like? What is his ultimate backstop? He has always told people that collectivism is bad ultimately, that you have to be an individual first and foremost, and that the quote woke mind virus really is identity politics, right? That is like a kind of raison d'etre of Jordan Peterson. And also, I'm not going to say your pronouns, right? um so in a I would say, like, whether he is see, the odd part about this is that it doesn't necessarily have to be formal, right? I am not saying that, for example, the British government is paying, or the Canadian government is paying Jordan Peterson. They probably hate Jordan Peterson. I'm just saying that structurally, the role that Peterson is playing is basically a backstop against millions of young men coming to the obvious conclusion that, hold on, we're under attack here. We need to band together and do something about it. There is another slightly different spin that I've heard some people put on this, which is that as white people do in fact become a minority, which is on course to happen in America soon, and in this country on a slightly longer time horizon. But I mean, white people are already a minority, for example, in London, or at least British white people are, right? I
Hmm.
mean, if you went cockney hunting, it'd be like trying to spot a red squirrel or something. I mean, they're an endangered species in London, right?
Yeah, from
Um,
memory, it was 35% white British in London, I think, something like that.
mhm. So the other way of thinking about this is that all of this has been some sort of training for how to act like a minority when the time comes. So essentially, then you get, the emergence of what are effectively white Al Sharptons, or or like a white David Lemmy or something like that, right? Where you're talking about, essentially, your politics becomes white minority grievance politics, where you're just arguing for a slice of the pie. Now, I'm not sure if I believe that either, but that is another possible. So the collectivization doesn't necessarily have to be have a kind of quote unquote scary majoritarian form of the sort that Peterson warns against. It could have a slightly more kind of it's just kind of training to accept a reduced status within the society, something like that.
Yeah,
But
is another explanation I suppose the Oren McIntyre thesis that you're against, which is that they are just true believers. So if they just believe, oh, white people are evil, they have white privilege, they're colonialists, then they'll
mhm,
just say it. If they were true believers, they would just act accordingly, wouldn't they? So that does actually fit with that. And my sort of second question there is,
mhm,
what are their actual views, if not woke? Is it just staying in power at all costs? Because they
mhm,
seem to, as a layman just observing, they seem to know what isn't them, like Jan 6 bad, Trump bad, although a bit complicated because he was contained and didn't really do much once in power.
mhm.
IFD in Germany bad, must be banned. So, like you said, that would fit with your thesis of, well, yeah, it's anything that's white collectivism, which I guess IFD kind of is. But
Mhm.
then it would also fit with Oren McIntyre. If they are just true believers, they would just lash out against white people because they hate them.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there is. I mean, I don't deny there are true believers within the system. Of course, there are. I mean, like any state ideology or even quasi religion, there are going to be fully paid up believers in this, especially some of the professors and so on whose kind of entire livelihood is writing books of this nature. I'm sure they are fully paid up believers. But uh, I mean, I don't know how much of the elite theory stuff that you've picked up from populist illusion, Nick. But there are two in every elite, in every ruling class. There are two layers of elite. There are the ruling elites, okay, and then there are the non or the governing elites. I think he calls them, and then there are the non-governing elites, which are a much bigger strand of like middle managers, and this is your professors and journalists and people like
Civil
that.
service and deep state stuff.
Yes, some civil service. I mean, it really depends on where you go, but there is a kind of bracket above them, the actual ruling class, the actual governing elites. And of course, one of the problems that we face as people who are trying to, in some way, fight against some of all of this is actually pinpointing, well, who are the ruling class, because they're extremely nebulous, and people come up with their own answers for that. A lot of people since COVID-19 basically say that, well, it's the Davos class, it's the WEF, it's Bill Gates and Tony Blair, right? Uh, I mean, that's one possible answer, but I feel like there may be other nodes in that system. Um, Certainly, since Elon Musk has taken over Twitter, and since Tucker Carlson has kind of gone it alone since leaving Fox, they have been revealing more and more about just how involved the intelligence services are, CIA especially, in essentially nudging and controlling the population. So, and when it gets to the level of those people, I am less convinced that they are ideological true believers. And I can tell you one of the reasons that I have this belief, Nick. There is a book called "Who Paid the Piper." I forget the author's name now, but you can look it up. It's a well-known book, which basically talks about how the CIA was involved in um, backing certain cultural movements that happened. I mean, one of the most famous ones is the art of Jackson Pollock, right? This is in the 1950s, because they wanted to project the image of America as a land of freedom and opportunity, as against the USSR, which is totalitarian and evil and socialist and so on. Um, and I mean, so many people that I mean, one of the things that I kind of blew my mind when I read that book. My last book was called The Prophets of Doom, where I talk about people like Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee, a very famous British history professor. And when I was researching that book, I found an extremely hostile review to Toynbee's famous book, A Study of History, by another historian called Hugh Trevor Roper, who some of your listeners will have come across if they ever studied history. And then in this book, Who Paid the Piper, it reveals that Hugh Trevor Roper was secretly an intelligent asset, and that the journals that he was involved with were set up by the CIA. I was like, this is crazy. So now, like something as benign as Hugh Trevor Roper's kind of review of Arnold Toynbee, in which he basically, by the way, calls Toynbee Hitler over and over again, and imagines him building a statue to himself in a 6 minute evisceration of Toynbee, which I mean, you have to read it to believe it. Um, something something as kind of far removed as what you'd imagine to be power as that actually had CIA controls over it. And the reason, Nick, that I have concluded that the ideology part matters less is because the other stunning revelation in that book, Who Paid the Piper, which I had not actually read when I wrote Populist Delusion, but I have read now, was that the man behind the purse strings of that CIA budget for all those activities, all those kind of psychological operations, was none other than James Burnham himself. James Burnham, the godfather of elite theory, the man who wrote the Machiavellians, and the man who absolutely despised liberalism. I mean, you can read his other books, he hated liberals. And it says in it that he despised the people he was working with. And yet he deliberately cultivated liberal ideology for the purposes of the ruling class, to the extent where James Burnham and his friends working within that division literally invented the non-communist left, the liberal left that we know of in Europe, the so-called new left, the left that you'd think of that Tony Blair and Bill Clinton come out of, was invented by them because they didn't want Europe to become communist. So, if you understand that, I mean, if you view that the workings of today are different, you'd have to then believe that there are no men like Burnham in the system at all. But I don't know. There are other interviews I read. I remember George W. Bush had an advisor called Karl Rove. Do you remember him?
I do,
Remember
yeah.
Karl Rove from? And he has a famous quotation. I can't remember it word for word now, but where he talks about like how America is an empire now, and it's not really about liberalism or democracy or ideology, but we are an empire. We create reality. Um, I mean, it's kind of a stunning quotation. But it also makes me think that not every element within the kind of George Bush administration of 20 years ago was a fully paid up liberal Democrat. In fact, if you read some of their writings, they sound much more like they've been reading Carl Schmitt and various other people. So, um, yeah, that would be my long. Sorry for the length of these answers, but that's why I've come to the view I have.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. So that book, I did the obnoxious googling it immediately thing. Is Francis Stoner Saunders, right? Who Paid the Piper?
Yeah,
So
that's
maybe
right.
I'll check that out because it reminds me of Alex Jones and all this stuff about Charles Manson was a CIA asset and all that stuff that sounds kind of mad and then turns out to be true. And it also reminds me of Mike Benz did that recent interview with Tucker Carlson, didn't he? Where he just exposed how far all this is CIA and deep state. And yeah, so that certainly seems very plausible. Well, you've proven in many cases it is actually true. Um, what was my other point? Oh yeah, the who are the elites point is really interesting because I can't remember who said this. Probably lots of people have said it. But one characteristic of the new elite, to use that Matt Goodwin term, is that they deny that they are the elite. So where the old elite of sort of posh blokes basically went, "Hello, we're the elite," please go to war and die now. But they would also go to war like Churchill and get stuck in because of their sense of duty. So you had an old sort of paternalistic elite, whatever you want to call them. But the new elite, like the Alistair Campbell elite, constantly pretending they're not the elite and they're still the rebels. And the Tory government makes that very easy for them. They go, oh, the Tories. But even when
Yeah,
they're in power, even if it's Starmer, they'll somehow do the same thing. I don't know. They'll just say he's actually too right wing or something or other. Or I don't know what they'll do. But it didn't seem to. They just seem to constantly deny, even though Blair had sort of ultimate power,
yeah,
they just constantly deny that they're the elite.
yeah. It is. That is also a very strange element of it. Um, and Blair, by the way, is also a very important person for my own understanding of how things work because one of the games I play is called Dark Lord Watch. We call him the Dark Lord, and this basically just involves following Tony Blair wherever he does, wherever he goes, right? Because he's always somewhere meeting someone. In fact, you can play a game, right? One of the games you can play is if a story comes up involving any country in the world, Niger, for example, or Kazakhstan, or pick a country out of a hat. Play a little
Yeah,
game and type in the name of that
Iceland.
country, right? Type in the name of that country and then stick in Tony Blair's name after it and see if Blair has had any involvement at all. And it turns
Right.
out, in the case of Kazakhstan, he was paid, hit or his institute was was paid millions of pounds to advise the government there. Um, or in Niger, do you remember there was that coup in Niger? Turned out the Tony Blair Institute was just about to set up shop in there in Nigeria and had to move its headquarters. Um, and essentially the coup that took place was the expulsion of Tony Blair from that country.
Really, I
It's
love the
like, it's
idea. He's
like
like Zelig,
I
just
mean,
everywhere.
it,
Like
it, it
in the
really
Congo, it's Tony Blair.
it really is remarkable how many kind of pies he has his finger in. But yes, they they've got this habit of trying to act like they're not in power or that they have no power. But one of the things I've noticed that they do, Blair does, is they have these briefings which take place before the main briefing. So everybody knows about Davos, for example, but and everybody has their eyes on that. But they don't have their eyes on the little meeting they have about a month beforehand, where literally Blair and some of his friends get around in front of an elite audience and talk about setting the agenda for Davos, i.e., what are we going to tell what are we going to tell the world leaders they think in a month's time? And they're very open about that. But it's
Right.
because they think, and if you go on YouTube, I mean, these things are open and available to watch, but they've got like 300 views, and at least half
Right.
of those are people who follow me. So,
Just
so
checking
yeah,
where Blair is this week. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of Bilderberg, which there's always Alex Jones stuff. There's that John Ronson book, them very entertaining, where they're searching for Bilderberg and they deny it exists, and then one day it gets too obvious it exists. So Peter Mandelson goes, "Oh yeah, it's in Portugal this year." And it's just like now they admit it exists, but they pretend it doesn't. And so now there's these. It's quite interesting. There's these little pre Davos meetings. So are you of the view that Schwab is the guy, or is he the front man because he just looks so comedically evil?
no, I think no, I think it's much more complicated than that. And in a strange way, the kind of Bond villain image of Klaus Schwab has been quite convenient because as long as people are looking at, I mean, the World Economic Forum is a conference at the end of the day where these world leaders. It's one of the conferences that they all meet at, but there are so many more of them. And like I said, just try to fill in Tony Blair's calendar one day, and
Okay.
you'll uh, you'll see that it's a much bigger network than that.
I'm definitely
Um,
going to do that. And also now of course, he's handing a literal leadership manual to Keir Starmer. So it couldn't
yes,
get any more still Blair. I mean, I might have slightly ripped you off because I did the post where I just said every leader since Tony Blair has been Blair. Like Cameron,
yes,
clearly Blair, all other Tories, Blair. And now Starmer is literally being handed a leadership manual by Blair. The only one people quibbled with me on was Boris. They said he wasn't Blair, but I don't know about that. Probably still was.
yeah. And do you know what was funny is that about a month before Jeremy Hunt became the Chancellor, he did a stream with Blair where he interviewed Blair, and it was very obvious from this interview that they were pals and that they knew each other in real life. And Blair knew the name of Hunt's son, who was in the background, and it was kind of, it's
Right.
funny how that happens. That, you know, a month before a soft coup, Hunt is meeting with somebody who really should be in the opposition. But of course
Yeah.
they're not in the opposition.
They're
I
not the
found that
opposition.
Karl Rove quote, by the way,
Okay.
which I'll read because I think it uh, kind of will explain my own thinking a little bit more. Now, this is attributed to Karl Rove, but it's only assumed that it's him, right? It's actually from a newspaper article, and the aide who's mentioned is anonymous. It says the aide said that guys like me were in what we call the reality based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. I nodded and murmured something about Enlightenment principles and empiricism. He cut me off. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating ever new realities which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We are history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left just to study what we do. And in a way, this is something I've also learned from Tony Blair, because what he did when he was the actual prime minister, if you have a look at the new Labour government, that's what they did. They acted first. They actually passed stuff, or they they'd already made the decision, and they'd done it already, and then they informed the public, and then people had a debate about whether, but it's already happened. If that makes any sense. Um, and a lot of the time, this is the way round things seem to happen historically as well. Is that whoever is in power acts, and it is justified after the fact, as opposed to beforehand. Does that make sense?
It does, and it reminds me of the chapter on Pareto in your book, where he's arguing that everything is just simply a post hoc rationalization, if that's the right phrase.
Yes.
He has these residues and these derivations and all these technical terms he creates, but basically it means that people do stuff and then they justify it later. Broadly, is that right?
Pretty much. That's exactly it.
Right.
And if you study what they have done, typically it's been that way around. But Blair was particularly notable for it because his government was incredibly centralized in a kind of small coterie of executives. Do you remember all the sofa meetings and the people who weren't invited? And it was just like, I mean, literally at certain points, just Blair and Astor Campbell and Mandelson and a few other guys in a closed room who decide what they wanted to do, then inform the cabinet, then inform the country. And now maybe you can have a debate about it, but we've already decided what we're doing. Um, and this is another thing that he does, by the way, which is he always speaks as if the decision is already taken, and the only debate is how do we execute the decision we've already taken. Um, so the entire possibility of a debate is foreclosed. Um, and this is a kind of quite magical way of thinking, because if you listen to Blair, for example, during COVID, in his thinking, whether to have the vaccine or not was a non-political decision. It had already been decided that this was the best course of action. How could you possibly debate that? It is already beyond politics. And that's how he basically pitches, and that is how that level of elite pitches a lot of their discourse. It's already happening. I mean, if you ever watch the proceeds at Davos, that's how they all talk. Climate change is another one. The debate is over already. We're
Right.
already on the. It's so it
You will own
i.e.
nothing and you will be happy. That's a statement.
So yeah. I mean that's one of the things I've learned from studying all of that.
Yeah. And oh gosh, just quickly on Blair, a couple of things. on Blair. I don't want to get off track on Blair, but one thing is he is very clever in that he's more he's a kind of putting the woke away type of guy, isn't he? He's like
Yes.
some of this woke stuff's going too far, and he's also like some of this net zero stuff's going too far. We can help with our financial institutions, can help the third world, but let's not get crazy about net zero because our emissions are already negligible. He's much more realistic on that. And the other thing I just want to say on Blair, while I remember, is this sort of the regime doesn't need your approval stuff from your take on elite theory or from elite theory. That's basically one facet of it. I really noticed that when Blair ignored the massive Iraq war protests, which I went on as a sort of
Hmm.
idealistic young person. I was like, I'm against this war, as most people seem to be. Huge numbers in London. And then we watched as Newsnight played it down, Jeremy Paxman played it down, the police played the numbers down, and someone said, well, the numbers were actually much higher than that. And Paxman went, you saying the police were lying? As if that was like not feasible. And even at that time, the left wing media would actually properly report it. Things like the Observer or the maybe the Independent, I can't remember. They would say, "Look, millions marched in London." Or something. They would have a massive figure and a massive picture of all the people. You'd be like, "Yes, that is what happened." Whereas the
Hmm.
regime was immediately like, "We're going to go do this anyway," and that was actually a sort of crushing moment for many people where they just checked out and became apathetic. I feel because Blair just said, "Yeah, we're going to do it anyway. It makes literally no difference," and everyone. I think that was perhaps Blair's greatest trick was that it made us sort of soporific after that, and we just sort of sleepwalked into this new world that
Hmm.
we have now, the new Labour, post New Labour Britain we have now.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a fantastic example of of what I call containment, which is what Blair was so good at, and is still trying to advise. I mean, in a way, he's a much higher caliber of elite than some of the people that are around now. Um, but he also recognised that by letting the march happen, which is, I think, the biggest march in the history of London, the biggest protest ever in London, over 1 million people, by many accounts, not Jeremy Paxman's, obviously. Um, is that it gave the anti-war coalition and the likes of Corbyn and the left and so on and Galloway, not all of them would have felt like this, but certainly a lot of the people would have felt like we've had a huge victory here. This is the biggest protest ever. Well done. Now they know how we feel. And it's then like, well, okay, and then what? He still basically did everything he wanted to do already and got elected again. Don't forget he got elected again after that
Yeah,
as well. um,
right. Everyone calls
but
him a war criminal now, but they didn't seem to mind at the time.
but you see, he took the wind by letting it happen. It takes the wind out of the sails. You've had the big victory of the march. Now what? So I mean, I don't know how long you stuck around those circles, but I imagine after the initial euphoria of the actual march, there was a great deflation. There was a great kind of dissipation of energy and involvement, and people would have kind of dwindled away and gone back to their jobs and gone on with
Yeah,
the rest of their lives.
there was that. There was already a containment aspect from the Liberal Democrats, Charles Kennedy at the time, saying no war without a second UN resolution, which was not what people were marching on. They were marching on no war. They sort of already took the wind out of it a little bit. And then, like you say, Blair just the fact that he just went on it made no people just naively felt this must make an impact. This many people, and as well, it was also dodgy and based on these WMDs. Everyone knew it was nonsense, or not everyone, but a lot of us suspected. Let's say it was nonsense, but yeah, it just made absolutely no difference. And it has made its difference to his sort of, reputation subsequently. So he's just gone a bit more behind the scenes, as you say, he's in Niger and he's everywhere. But it hasn't really damaged him, except it's damaged his sort of the narrative of Blair a little bit. Would you say?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it was difficult for him personally to come to terms with the fact that he is a publicly toxic figure now, right? I think at one point he harbored ambitions of a genuine comeback. Now I think he's just content to ultimately just control the entirety of UK politics from behind the scenes, which is which
He's a
is
humble guy.
I mean, it sounds like an exaggeration, but it really isn't. Another thing that you can do is you can trace the white papers that some of these NGOs, like the Blair Institute, which is a big one, but there are others. Just read their white papers and see how many of them basically become government policy within the space of 6 months. Um, and the reason they are able to do that is because they are the organized minority.
Right.
Like when you're sleeping tonight, somebody at the Tony Blair Institute is dreaming up new ways of how to tax your car. I mean, you think I'm joking, but I'm not. It's their job 24/7. And when all of the politicians are worried about what this headline is saying or what that headline is saying, they're so busy, you've watched the thick of it, you know what they're like. They're just constantly worried about whatever the latest thing, the approval ratings are. So they don't really have time to come up with kind of actionable plans and policies. But some of these think tanks and NGOs do have that time. And that is basically the service they're providing. They're giving the government off the shelf solutions pretty much for ways, new ingeniously dystopian ways to manage your life, basically. um and I'll just give you this one for free, Nick. The one to watch out for is the ID cards. This is something that Blair has never let go of.
Oh, he's obsessed.
He was defeated 3 times, I think, in Parliament when he was the Prime Minister, and one of them was the ID cards. And he has never let that go. He tried to use COVID to bring it back, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he was, and he's tried to use climate stuff to bring it back. But I think the ultimate one, and I'm almost certain that this will happen in the next 10 years, is that they're going to use the illegal immigration crisis, the small boats, as a pretext to bring in the digital ID, because it will be a way to sell it to the Daily Mail, basically, or to the right. And I can guarantee you, people rolling their eyes listening to this will, when it's presented to them in a slightly different way, they'll jump on that. They'll be like, yes, that will be a way to track the illegal migrants and keep them from gaming the system or whatever. So,
Yeah, I have already heard that. We did a story, and it was suggesting, hey, we need to track who these people are. They're just roaming around. They get off the boats. They commit crimes. We need an ID card. I've absolutely heard it. Yeah, and that's one way it really would appeal to the right, because, like, hang on, migrants running around. Yeah, that would be very clever. It's so funny how he's never given up on ID cards. It just makes you think, like, what's he going to do with them? It's something bad.
I mean, it's even more sinister than that, because he basically wants every country to adopt these ID cards. So if you have a
Right.
look at what he's been up to in Africa, and even in his meetings in Europe and so on, it's basically a system where everybody's joined up to the same grid, the same network. So in Africa, he works in partnership with Bill Gates and various other people, and it's sold as, oh, we're helping these poor countries develop their infrastructure. Actually, what it is we're going to give you all of the internet and your broadband networks and so on, but we keep hold of the data. We keep hold of the infrastructure. Still basically belongs to the original investors, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, you can get to harmonize all of the different countries' various security apparatuses if they're all running on the same network. So I think that would be the kind of globalist governance dream, where
Right.
the entire Western sphere of influence is under the same, almost like kind of China-like grid.
The Blair network
The Blair
with the
network, yeah.
Blair ID card. Wow. It's frightening. But I do want to, before you go get on to elite theory itself, which you've mentioned a few times, just so the listener isn't confused in case they haven't swatted up on this stuff. It's a bit of a red pill or black pill for me, which is well, essentially, you talk about Gaetano Mosca, hopefully pronouncing that right,
Mhm.
and his idea that, well, let's just quote from him: in reality, the dominion of an organized minority obeying a single impulse over the unorganized majority is inevitable. The power of any majority is irresistible as against each single individual in the majority who stand alone before the totality of the organized minority. 100 men acting uniformly in concert with a common understanding will triumph over 1,000 men who are not in accord and can therefore be dealt with one by one. So this kind of destroys certain ideas one might loosely hold, like the silent majority. Well, yes, they may
Mhm.
exist, but they're kind of useless. Or the idea that we think that the people are going to somehow wrest power back from the elite. We might sort of find ourselves believing that. But you talk about the myth of the tipping point, and
Mhm.
there's this idea that somehow if the plebeians become too disgruntled with their leaders, then the people will rise up and overthrow them. But as Moscow shows, this has never happened in history, not even once. So I think we all, not we all, I don't speak for we all, but I certainly have sort of vaguely imagined things like this. And yeah, the silent majority, and there must be a tipping. We've heard a lot about it'll swing back and there'll be a tipping point with all this wokeness and so on. But really, what Musk is saying is no, it's just one elite after another. It's always a minority. They always rule over the majority. They take them out one by one as individuals, and then they're maybe replaced by a counter elite later. But that will just be the same thing again with a slightly different flavor. Although I suppose those on our side might say we'd at least hope that a new elite would be more aligned with us. We could talk about that as well. But is
Mhm.
that basically it?
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, it must be because I've read it verbatim from your book.
Yeah, that is exactly it. Now, of course, one of the problems that people will run into straight away is, well, what about all the different revolutions then that have happened? Okay, um, and the story there is basically that the current ruling class in some way loses control, or they lose will. Okay, they lose will, um, and when they lose the will to rule, um, it it's not long for the governance structure. Okay, the easiest example that I can point to of a ruling class that just stopped uh, having that will was probably the USSR in the late 1980s. The Gorbachev era. They basically kind of gave up. Right? There aren't that many examples of that. Usually, there's a bit more struggle and violence involved, right? But that was one example. Okay. Um, but there are, I mean, that is not the kind of regime change that captures the imagination. To stick with Russia, people would probably much more imagine the Russian Revolution, the one in 1917. Um, and the story there is that, the Tsar did lose control to an extent, and there was a popular uprising, but there was also an organized minority who did quickly seize control, um, and eliminated their factional rivals with ruthless efficiency. And that, of course, was Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And one of the things that I've really learned from reading elite theory, Marxists hate elite theory. They really hate elite theory because it's an alternative method of explaining history, and it's not the same class struggle as theirs, right? The Marxist theory of history is all about ownership of the means of production and things like this. Um, but if you read Lenin, like he's got books like What Must Be Done and so on, like he understood this whether he knew it or not, i.e., that they had to be organized, can't be a democracy, what Lenin says goes. There shall be no dissent. We can't really, you know, we can't really accept any deviations from what the plan is, and so on and so forth. Um, and then the story of the reign of terror is basically the Bolsheviks eliminating any possible rival factions that could have taken over the void that was left by the Tsars. Exactly the same story, by the way, that happened in Iran in 1979. And it just so happens I very recently did a show. If anybody wants to check out my YouTube channel, I did a review of an Adam Curtis documentary, um, looking at the Iranian Revolution, where you can actually, it kind of lays it out after the Shah had lost control. Essentially the Shah told the army to shoot in the crowd. Army wasn't up for it. Well, it's kind of over for him. Um, the story then is of the Ayatollah and the mullahs being the most ruthless and most organized minority, as against the socialists, the intellectuals, and all of the other people who backed the revolution. So something that was genuinely popular quickly then became elite driven. And that is basically the story of all regime changes, whether violent or not. So there we go.
Yeah, the English Civil War seems like a fairly textbook one as well. I was thinking that's clearly just a different elite, a sort of king in all but name comes in, takes out the king, then it goes back. Seems to fit with it as well. Um, I mean,
What do you mean, Nick? Oliver Cromwell, he won a debate in the free marketplace of ideas. I'm only joking.
yeah, well, exactly. I was trying to think of examples with my limited knowledge of history. I did get the third highest grade in the country at history A level without knowing anything about history because our education system's broken. But I was trying to think of examples. I was like, English Civil War. I was like, oh no, that's a really terrible example. That's actually perfectly proves elite theory. But I'm sure people have their little examples. But this theory is pretty thorough and just saying no, it's always this way. And there are interesting examples like Trump. I was thinking of. I was reading this passage. The alternative candidates for election will similarly have been pre-selected by elites whose campaigns are managed by organized minorities so that any result will favor their interests. So one thinks of the uniparty here, which we keep hearing of the Tories and Labour, which I think is that the man on the street will say, yes, that is a single party now. Many people will think that. Trump is a bit of a Trump's an interesting example, isn't he? I'm not further on in your book yet where I think you might address him directly, but
Mhm.
he's an interesting example because he ostensibly was a threat to that current elite, and yet he was contained by his bad hiring policies, by the intelligence services, by the deep state, and so on. And
Mhm.
now he's back again, and they're trying to put him in prison. So, how far is Trump a genuine threat, a genuine counter elite, or is he just? Are they just containing him? Is he just a continuation?
I think they've learned how to contain Trump. Over the past well, how long's it been now? 8 years, almost a
Yeah.
decade now. Um, but I do think there are a few things that did catch them a little bit on the hop. Um, they were able to deal with it because, as I say somewhere in the book, Donald Trump was never really the president. I.e., he had the name, he had the title, but when Donald Trump gave an order, those orders were not carried out, and we know that for a fact now because it's on record. Um, you know, it happened when he ordered the withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan. It happened. It happened a number of times where the system itself basically refused to carry out his orders. Um, so it doesn't really matter if you have the mandate of the people, or if you won an election, or even if you hold the office. The you know, so what happened was is that Donald Trump represented a populist revolt against the ruling class, but Donald Trump did not enact what we would call a genuine circulation of elites. That is, he did not replace the old ruling class, who are his enemies, with his friends. Um,
Right.
now, what I think this is a very interesting topic, though, which will be of interest to everybody watching this, because in the time since, whether they've read my book or not, by the way, some of them have, some of them haven't. I do think people have got more organized, and certain elites. I'm thinking of somebody like Elon Musk would be the most prominent example, but Elon Musk has many friends too. Vivek Vivek Ramaswamy is another one who nobody would have heard of 8 years ago. Another one would be Peter Thiel. Tucker Carlson has kind of gone rogue, has he not? And I think he's part of this network too. There are people like Douglas McGregor, who was a high-ranking official, in the Gulf War. He is increasingly outspoken now. And there are all these people who are identifiably elites who are getting more and more organized and are backing each other up, and who are clearly part of something that Donald Trump is bringing about. Um, so I do think that uh, we could be. This is speculative. I don't have hard proof, but it feels like we are in the process of a new set of elites, at least asserting themselves within the power structure. Um, Elon Musk and Peter Thiel are particularly interesting characters because they are connected to the US security apparatus and therefore have some leverage over them. Um, Thiel with his company Palantir, and Musk obviously with his space stuff, you know,
SpaceX.
SpaceX, yeah. And this is something that Moscow and Pareto do talk about, where if you have a kind of new social class emerge, easiest example would be the industrialists in the 19th century, right? when the industrialists emerged as a genuine kind of power faction, it didn't take long for them to start asserting themselves in the actual ruling class. The repeal of the Corn Laws being the kind of symbol of all of that, and the doctrine of laissez-faire. But really, what that was the industrialists saying, "Listen, we're here now," and the aristocracy of that time, the old lords and the old, the royalty and all of those guys, they had to make a settlement with that. They had to decide, well, how we're gonna just resist these industrialists, or are we gonna bring them in? And for a period of time there in the 19th century, the aristocrats and the industrialists were kind of at an uneasy peace, and they were working together during the kind of mid British Empire there under Victoria. Um, so it's certainly possible that you get these dislocations, and I think Thiel and Musk and these kind of big tech entrepreneur billionaires are an identifiably new class of power broker in America and in Britain and in the West in general, who are clearly aligning themselves against the old structure. And one of the most interesting analyses I came across of this recently was from a chap called King Pill, just a small channel, where he pointed out that there's a generational difference between the Musk and Thiel and so on, who are identifiably Gen Xers, right? Obviously Gen Xers, and the old ruling class, who are quite identifiably Boomer in orientation, or in Joe Biden's case, literally the silent generation, because Joe Biden is absolutely ancient. But so that there's a generational and also source of wealth thing happening. So it's possible that this time, when Trump comes back, we will actually see a bigger change than what we did before. Who knows, though? Time will tell.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously they're doing their best to stop that happening by financially destroying Trump and possibly putting him in prison, which suggests there is a real threat. That is really interesting. I mean, the richest man in the world, who's just bought the most influential platform in the world, would seem to have some serious chance of making this happen. And I don't know where you stand on Millet, but someone just sent me a meme today: the Virgin Trump versus the Chad Millet, and it was Trump printed a shit ton of money, corporate bailouts, stabbed in the back by his own FBI, couldn't even repeal Obamacare, hates Bitcoin, gave Fauci a medal. Whereas Millet's like repealed 300k laws, hated by bankers, flew to Davos just to tell Klaus Schwab to go fuck himself, eliminated half the government in 2 weeks, trolls shit libs, loves Bitcoin, literally a rock star. So, and you do see Musk sort of hanging out with, I'm not sure I've actually seen him hanging out with Millet, but they seem very aligned. And
Hmm.
it's a kind of, as you pointed out, though, they are pro-immigration, but it's a better choice. It's much better for us, but it's not perfect. But it's like they're pro-immigration. Musk is sort of vehemently against anti-white racism to a sort of almost like,
Yeah.
is this a sort of 4chan channel degree? But he's
Hmm.
also very much colorblind, back to Fresh Prince, isn't he? So it's
Hmm.
an interesting. They're sort of Bitcoiny kind of libertarian people, aren't they? Is that kind of vibe, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that I mean, there is another power faction that can never be ignored, of course, in America and in this country, but especially in America, and that is, when it comes to somebody like Milei or even Trump, and that is the Zionists essentially. And Milei, for example, is extremely pro-Israeli, as I'm sure. Well, if you follow him, you would not have you could not have failed to notice that. And I think that it could be that these two different groups, i.e., the kind of Elon Musk technocratic entrepreneurial types, um, and uh, you know Israel supporters, could actually have a temporary situation where their interests align for the moment, because certainly within Western politics, support for Israel is increasingly becoming aligned with the right, and against wokesters and the left and so on and so forth. Now, if you remember, Elon Musk had a bit of a run-in with that faction a while back, and he had a meeting with Ben Shapiro, and they went to Auschwitz together and things like this. But it could be that Elon Musk has kind of made his peace with all of that and has agreed that actually, for what we want to do, we can work together on this for a while. You know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good type thing, and we can work together. Um, and I think that that may be part of what's happening as well. Get a kind of aligning of the stars, um, because believe it or not, a lot of the people in those sorts of spheres actually want Donald Trump back because they think he'll be stronger on that issue than Joe Biden, who is, depending on how far into neocon circles you want to go, some of them think he's outright pro-Iran. So that is another factor at play. But certainly, I think Elon Musk. What makes Elon Musk and Thiel a bit different from some of the other people we've seen, though, when it comes to this, is that he's unpredictable and he always keeps them guessing as to whether he's fully under control or not. Um, i.e., just because he's had these meetings doesn't mean he's not going to say something down the line because he's done it before again and again and again. And that kind of loose cannon aspect of Musk, I think, scares some elements of the regime because he really does have his own mind. But ultimately, you're right, Nick. His vision is quite back to Fresh Prince. Um, and Tucker Carlson, who's become a bit of a mouthpiece for this faction that we've been talking about, he actually came right out and said about a week ago that that's what he wants to do. He wants to take the country back to 1993. So that was the most direct kind of declaration that this is the actual goal of these people. And honestly, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if they succeeded. Um, versus the kind of madness we've all experienced. But I will just say that if you think of yourself as a dissident, when that happens, it will be very difficult to remain one because that's why they do it. So I'll just say that as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, Dominic Cummings even talked about that. He said, with some scorn, the UK politicians' dream is just to get back to that time between the Berlin Wall falling down and 9/11. And they'd also, why can't we all just get back to that time? And he was saying how that's naive and doesn't meet our current challenges. And I can see that. But it could be a very nice, at least, illusion for people like us. I mean, to go back to because you look at the 90s itself. I mean, I've noticed with people like you and Carl Benjamin and me, we see me on a sort of more minor scale because I'm not as famous as you guys, but it's like I've noticed that we all sort of seem to just in like the 90s, like, oh, this seems like good, this is like a free time, and maybe we weren't even that politically engaged, and then then it all went away and we went, oh, hang on, this isn't very pleasant. So but I wonder if we were naive, if it was a better time, or was it just that the seeds were planted of Blair in '97, I suppose, and it was we just didn't see what was coming, and maybe a lot of people in that category. So that's one thing I sometimes think about. But then also, if we went back to it, if we did go back to Fresh Prince, you say, what would it be like? Would it actually be much nicer, or would we just be tricked once again? You know what I mean? With the wool over our eyes. That is an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, for the first point, I would say that you're basically right that it was not as it wasn't as good as we remember because, of course, all this stuff was happening under the hood. It just felt nicer because it wasn't put in our face all the time. But these things did happen, you know. I mean, in America, the LA race riots of 1992, for example, literally right in the middle of when Fresh Prince was on, that happened. George H.W. Bush had to call out the National Guard, which Donald Trump didn't do in 2020, by the way. Um, so things weren't necessarily all they were cracked up to be back then. It was just the messaging was different, and in a way, the kind of bubble that we all lived in felt more nice and cozy for us because lots of people's perception of everything around them is formed by the media. And to come on to your second question, the biggest challenge that they're going to face is how do you do that with the internet around? Because I think one of the other aspects of this, in fact, it's related to the rise of figures like Musk and Thiel, is that as the internet has become more and more part of everybody's life, more and more people have unplugged from mainstream media. I was just saying the other day, I don't watch TV anymore. I barely watch any films anymore. There was one point in my life, like if me and you had talked, Nick, if me and you had a podcast conversation, let's say in 2005, right? I doubt we would have even talked about the Iraq War. I reckon we would have talked about movies and films and our favorite comedy shows. You're a comedian, right? We would have talked about comedy. I would have talked
Hmm.
about the intricacies of how Stuart Lee constructs his 10-minute monologues, or we would have been talking about stuff like that. We would not have been talking
Hmm.
about this.
No, we
And
were dragged into it. A lot of people were dragged into politics and are very kind of unlikely, they're unlikely conservatives in a way. I always think it seems like me, you, and Carla are all in that. We're sort of really, well, I see myself more like an artsy fartsy person. Was listening to a lot of obscure music, watching comedy, as you say. I was obsessed with sitcoms, Seinfeld and Larry Sanders and so on. Watching films. I think the '90s is the best film decade, by the way.
mhm.
And yeah, listen to music. And yeah, I was even reading postmodern novels and stuff like that. Shocking stuff. But and then somehow we're sucked into this conservatism very strangely. But when we're really just sort of displaced. Not even I'm on the cusp. I'm the oldest possible year for millennial, and you were saying today on X they're the best people, the millennial Gen X cusp people
The
are the
Zennials,
best
yeah,
people.
yeah, the
Yeah,
Zennials,
yeah.
exactly. We are the
We're
special.
unlikely candidates to be conservatives.
We're the special. I'm telling you, the Zennials are special. It's me, you, Carl Benjamin, PJW. If you ever see him, he's of the same sort of age. I was born in 1982, so that's kind of right in and around there. If you grew up watching like Ghostbusters and Thundercats and the A
Yeah,
Team
we're
and
almost the
stuff,
exact same age. Ed Dutton's in there.
Ed Dutton,
He's
yeah.
just
And I don't know what it is about why specifically people of our age bracket are able to kind of or have been able to step outside of all of this to an extent. And it is possibly because we grew up in a pre-internet age, but we also came into adulthood just as the internet was becoming ubiquitous. So we are some of the few people on Earth who I would say are fully pop literate, or cine literate and pop literate, i.e., we get all of the TV and film and music references, but we're also internet literate. Um, and sometimes I even joke, Nick, that we are the only people in the world who actually understand GIFs and memes, because we saw the original thing and we understand it in the meme culture as well.
that's hilarious.
So,
You remind me of a quote from a '90s movie I was watching again the other day, The Thin Red Line, 1999, where he says, "I've seen another world. Like we've seen another world. We've seen
exactly.
the old world, and we've seen the new world." That's hilarious. True though, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Zoomers are just mental. I know you post about them quite a lot, and we have the brilliant Rory working on our podcast. He appears sometimes, and he's a pretty advanced Zoomer. But Zoomers are mainly just like missing whole chunks of their brain and stuff. Some of them they just suddenly can't do something really basic, or don't know what you don't know what's going to come out of their mouths next. Like they don't know what an avocado is, or I don't know,
Yeah.
they suddenly can't spell or walk or something. Or there was a piece about menu anxiety which we covered on GB News. They get anxious picking something from a menu.
Yeah, I heard that too. Another one I heard is that a shocking number of them can't tie their shoelaces because of Velcro or something. So there we are.
Just big
Yeah.
chunks missing. But yeah, so they weren't brought up in the real world. But you're saying, yeah, how could they contain us now with the internet?
Mhm,
And that's going to make it. And how can they maintain Fresh Prince with people constantly banging on about Palestine and
mhm,
things like that? I mean, where one way I look at that is with comedy is that the funniest unit of a joke is you and your mates at school, because the in jokes are so layered and can go
mhm,
on for years, and they're so dependent on close knowledge of people. And then the worst unit is the world. So that when we have the Twitter and things like this, suddenly jokes are offensive because your school unit is the best, but then England is a great comedy country, and then Britain and so on,
mhm,
and then the West and the Anglosphere and all this America and Canada but then the worst is, oh, now jokes have got to be global. So you'll notice that for the last X amount of years, every joke has been offensive to someone, because of course it is. That's the nature of jokes. Because humor, I think I've made my point. The,
mhm.
the, the more generic it gets, the less funny it gets. And so, one thing I think about, it's a bit of a tangent, but on the internet, yeah, how can you maintain any kind of sort of closed system? How can you maintain any kind of cozy, slightly
Mhm.
cozy system like Back to Fresh Prince when you've got someone banging on about, well, I'm from this disadvantaged country and I hate you all? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think increasingly what they will do, whether this will work or not, remains to be seen. But I've already started to see it happen. Is that they will draw the conclusion that a lot of young people spend their time watching influencers online, like me and you, right? Or increasingly as TikTokers. TikTok. I mean, some of the views they get over on TikTok are in the hundreds of millions. Okay, um, and I think that they will try to influence the influencers. It's kind of classic Edward Binet stuff, really. But how can we get our handle on those and in some way? Okay, so the illusion of what currently exists on the internet will be maintained, but increasingly everybody will belong to some sort of controlled network already. And, you know, in a way, they'll be able to keep everybody on a sort of reservation. What that will look like may be a bit different from Fresh Prince, we'll see. But I think that's really what they're going to have to do, because they've opened Pandora's box in a way with the internet, and I'm not sure if Western populations will react kindly to the kind of hard controls we see in a country like Iran, where they literally just turn the internet off or outright ban Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, or a country like China, which of course has got the Great Firewall. Um, I mean, we have seen bits of that though as well. Uh, to take the war on Russia, for example, or the Russian war on Ukraine. I'll put it that way. Um, since that started, Russia Today has been outright banned from. Like, if you try to watch a Russia Today video on Twitter or on YouTube, you'll get a notice saying the UK government does not allow this to be aired in your country. So they've got those hard controls there if they want them as well. Um, and there wasn't much of a fuss about that either. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in time, Western populations will just be like, yeah, you can uh, you can use these hard controls on the internet. It's necessary because of Putin or something. So maybe.
Yeah, that could happen. I mean, I remember that time as well. There was an attempt to shut down GB News. The only time my brother ever messaged me about GB News, never didn't even know what shows I was on. The only time he messaged me is he'd heard it was funded by Russia and he was hoping it would be shut down. So because he's fully deep state, so he was just like, oh, I heard it's run by Russia. He was just looking forward to it being shut down. But it reminds me of Canada seems to have blocked the internet, and a few instances you hear them Canadians post to you saying, "Oh, this is blocked in my country." And the EU, of course, are trying to censor X. Are in a constant war with Musk, so that's another way that could happen. So yeah, maybe they'll just censor the internet.
This is another thing, by the way, the shutting down of GB News through Ofcom. That was another Tony Blair special. Ofcom was
Right.
only established by the Blair government in 2003, I think it was. And rather than shut it down as soon as they came to power, the Tories have spent the past 14 years now expanding their remit, giving them new powers, giving them new, you know, bits of money, basically making them more powerful. Um, so there are lots of. I mean, if any Tory politicians are watching this and you're wondering why it is that huge swathes of the public are no longer going to vote for them as for stuff like this, is because they
Yeah.
had they had power, and they've had power for 14 years, and rather than putting a single thing that the new Labour did back or repealing it, or they've actually locked in Blairism as a structural feature of the country. I mean, that the Supreme Court would be another one, utterly un-British institution. Um, I mean, the list is basically endless, as to the number of ways that the Tories basically created their own funeral pyre.
Yeah.
And this is the problem, really, because a lot of people are never going to forget the fact that the Tories have basically shattered the illusion of democracy in the country, have they not? Because you're meant to have a choice. And if I vote blue rather than red, that means you do some conservative stuff sometimes. But they didn't do any of the things they needed to do. 80-seat majority, and they could have undone all of that with a flick of a pen. Because there's no, there are no checks and balances in this country like in America. So if the government wanted to say we're shutting down Ofcom tomorrow, they could do it, but they don't want to. The fact is they don't want to because they have the same beliefs and are part of the same power structure as all of the people who are part of New Labour. So there we
Exactly.
go.
And
Yeah.
Cameron called himself the heir to Blair allegedly at a dinner, and that's it. And they've that's it. It's when it proves elite theory. It's the same elite. There has been no counter elite. It's the same people, different color, red or blue, and it's still to this day. And the Tories keep dropping the ball for that reason, or what you think of as dropping the ball or making mistakes, but actually they're just the same people. I mean, when someone like Jess Phillips says, as she did yesterday, I think, as we record, "Oh, I can't believe Rishi Sunak's going to allow this hatred and Islamophobia on in his party," and then lo and behold, Lee Anderson is suspended, and it's like, why would you play into this obvious sort of leftist trick? And it's like, oh, because you agree with them. That's
Yeah.
the answer. You agree with them. And then Rishi's just issued a statement today as we record. It doesn't mention Islam once. I mean, MPs have been intimidated by Islamic extremists to the point where they feel under threat and worried about which way they're going to vote and so on. And he doesn't even mention Islam in his statement. And then still you get people like Adil Ray, OBE, complain that he didn't talk about Islamophobia in the statement, which is just so absurd. I can't even begin. That does bring me to a question I really wanted to ask you while we
Mm.
have time, if we do still, which is based on elite theory. Could an Islamic party get in, a la Michelle Welbeck's submission, which many
Mhm.
people have read? That's in France and it's fictitious, but it could happen in England for real. Because I'm looking at this and going, okay, so you talk about Pareto, who had this class one and class two of people who are a bit like Machiavelli's foxes and lions. So the class ones are the foxes who are a bit more cunning. They're adept at manipulation and manufacturing consent, while the lions are adept at the use of force. So these are two groups, and the foxes, which we've had as the kind of the Blairites are definitely foxes. They're kind of
Mhm.
cunning, managerial, diplomatic. They sort of hold on to power through adapting, whereas the lions are more straightforward. They seem to be more religious and family type, solid sort of people who take over. And then theoretically, the lions could take over after a period of foxes, though it's by no means certain. So I was looking at this and going, okay, just in my layman analysis, is Islam a kind of organized? It's clearly an organized minority in this
Mhm.
country, and it's clearly and it seems more lion-like. But
Yes.
then I go, is it? Because if you look at the way Sadiq Khan has kind of has kind of absorbed the more radical elements of Islam, or they're using him. I don't know which way around you'd put it, but the way they're acting is actually relatively subtle. Some of it's just, but then some of
Mhm.
it's just pure force and threatening MPs. So I'm not sure. In Michelle Welbeck's book, it happens through very much sort of fox-like means. They just get in through proportional representation. They're very slick. So one thing is which category are Islam in, and two, could they, following elite theory, just quite easily take over and become the new elite?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I have to say, I am not convinced that Sadiq Khan is necessarily an Islamist. He seems to me, I mean, increasingly Sadiq Khan feels like a bit of a relic to me. He's like a kind of woke politician from 10 years ago or something, and it's just like he has not updated his play. Like almost nobody sounds like Sadiq Khan anymore, apart from maybe Justin Trudeau in Canada and a couple of other people. But he is just he's just running the old script of diversity is our strength and all of that, when a lot of other Labour politicians have kind of moved on from that. Um, but that does give cover, I'm afraid to say, for more radical elements because it prevents anybody from pointing out what's been happening on the streets of London, and it stops people from pointing to these organised elements which are undoubtedly there. Um, on balance, I would say they generally are more lion-like, right? Which is that, I mean, a very good example would be the whole business with Charlie Hebdo, which I'm sure you remember. The throat or various times where they physically threatened uh, political figures, journalists, politicians, and the system caves. And the reason the system caves does come down to this, because um, the defining feature of the Fox type elites is that they rule through persuasion. They rule through clever tricks of perception management. Okay, and they do not like to use force. And if they do have to use force, it's generally clumsy, and it generally comes off really badly for them. Um, in fact, there are so few examples that I can't really think of any. Possibly when Justin Trudeau cracked down on the trucker protest in Canada. That was one time where they used something approaching hard force, right? And it was clumsy,
Yeah.
and it came off really
Uh,
badly. Do you remember that?
Of course, yeah, and he froze their bank accounts. I mean, lockdown's another example. Would you call lockdowns forced? Depends on the country how forceful it was.
Yeah, I mean, even then, they did it in the softest way they could have. Um, when you compare it to how the Chinese did their lockdowns, for example, right? I mean, it was ours was softer. I mean, I'm not saying that lockdown was pleasant to live through or anything. Kind of drove us all crazy. I mean, I was driven so mad, Nick. The lodge, which you may have heard me talk about, I literally bought this because I couldn't work. It was driving me like I had a baby in the house, and I just couldn't. So I ended up buying a lodge just to have somewhere to get away where I could work, because it's difficult to work from home when you've got a little kid there.
Oh, I didn't know about the lodge. Very Twin Peaks, but I didn't know about that.
but
Toby lives in a shed on my other podcast, so you're in the lodge.
but yeah, generally speaking, they prefer to use soft managerialism, um, and Islam tends to be more brutal. I mean, other examples of soft and hard managerialism: Stalin, really brutal. That's kind of hard lion type elite. So it doesn't necessarily flip left and right. You can have a left wing lion, like to the extent that Stalin was left wing. um, I don't actually think that Islam could take over Britain, and I can tell you why. Um, there's something about Islam as a religion that has no real interest for Westerners and for British people in general. Um, there are very few instances of anybody kind of reading the scriptures or converting or really showing any interest at all. Um, and for that reason, I feel like the um, I mean, how can I put it this way? I would say the majority of British people and people elsewhere in the West, they don't perceive Islam as something that could be something for us, right? They perceive it as an external and outside thing, ultimately, um, which is actually partly why you get so many of these problems, because people, they recognize that these people aren't integrating. They they remain militantly against everything we our whole way of life seemingly, and yet they're still here. And I think, rightly, many people ask, well, how have our leaders allowed that to happen? Um, but ultimately, I would actually, if I had to make a bet, in the long run, I would suggest that it would be more likely for them to end up leaving than ever taking over properly. That may sound really optimistic, but I just can't really see a mechanism by which they'd uh, take over. And I mean, you're imagining, Nick, a kind of caliphate where they just use like brute force to subdue the population, something like that.
No, because I read this Welbeck novel and it got all freaked out by a novel. I'm imagining something more subtle where Farage is already saying they could have in Rochdale they could win. We see the way they lean on politicians, and we've just changed our parliamentary procedure the other day because of, well, this is what the speaker claimed, because of threats against certain MPs if he didn't alter the procedure of that day. So I just see it could be more subtle. It's different. I think it depends on proportional representation in that novel in France, but that would make it easier. It
Mhm.
could be more subtle. I don't know exactly how. That's why I'm asking you. And I'm not saying it's necessarily by force, but I'm not sure. It's just perhaps by intimidation or just gradually. I mean, well, they're very smart about sort of taking over areas and voting en masse. And look how many times Sadiq Khan's been elected. Even though he's
Mhm.
useless. So it might be a bit more organized and smart than one might
I,
imagine.
I,
But I don't
I
know exactly.
I mean, what one thing they could have, they could achieve, which would be more realistic, I think. I don't think that Islam's ever going to win over the hearts and minds of European people. Period. To be honest, but
It's just too aesthetically
it,
alien in a sense.
it just feels too outside. It'd be like, I don't know. I mean, to use to use a tortured analogy, it would be like the kind of the men of the West deciding, right, we're going to adopt orcish ways now, that because it's perceived as outside. Does that make sense? It's not
Hmm.
perceived as being uh, something that could be part of you. Um, what One of the things I do see as a possibility, though, depending on how things go, is basically devolved power and ethnic enclaves, where you could have an area that is majority Muslim that has either de facto or de jure Sharia law as an enclave, right? But this is quite a distinct claim from saying that Sadiq Khan is going to declare London a caliphate or something. I don't see that ever happening, really, unless the majority of Londoners become Muslims, i.e., unless the population of London is replaced with a majority Muslim population, not through conversion, just through bringing more Muslims in. Um, then that they could genuinely say, well, the majority of people here already do some form of Sharia law, so therefore, you know. But I think we're getting into the realms of science fiction, to be honest. So I
Yeah,
doubt it.
it's not something I'm necessarily want to go on about, but if they're at 6.5% of the population now and already having this level of influence, the claim goes in the 2040s, people are talking about 20% of the population. So imagine how much influence they would have on society. I mean, I don't know exactly how it would function, but that's one claim. But yeah, in terms of elite theory, you're saying they wouldn't be the new counter elite. All right. What's the time? We've done a long time, so I don't want to keep you. But there's so much we could go into, and I've got to go and do my boomer containment job at GB. But we didn't. The only thing we didn't, big thing we didn't touch on really is the boomer truth regime, which is
Hmm.
very interesting. Which is basically that I think that we're not in sort of liberalism, we're in anti-racism, and we're in a kind of world where the 60s is the ultimate good and the Nazis are the ultimate evil. And we're kind of
Yeah.
trapped in this paradigm of what you call the deracinated individual
Hmm.
who's just a kind of, well, to be honest, I was listening to Constantine on a clip. He was replying to Callum at Lotus Eaters, and he said, "No, this is what I believe. I'm a centrist." And I was listening to it in light of your work, not to have a pop at Constantine, but he was saying, like, I take from here and there, and I think of it as an individual and see what I believe, and I use the data. And I was thinking a few things. I was thinking, okay, well, the data is basically you're trapped in scientism, which is just sort of
Hmm.
the current philosophy du jour anyway. So it's not like you're outside of it. Your individualism just locates you in the boomer truth regime anyway. I'm an individual, and I think for
Hmm.
myself. And it also, in elite theory, makes you a kind of pretty useless pawn to be, driven over by the organized minority. So I was thinking, this is the problem with this type of thinking. All you're saying is like, yes, I'm a modern man of the regime, really.
Yeah.
But when I listen to your work, I'm like, this is ineffective, and also it shows that you're not even the sort of counterculture that you think you are. So I don't know. Any comment on that briefly? The old boomer
No,
truth
no. I
regime.
mean, I basically agree with everything that you've said there. The boomer. I mean, it's not just boomers. It's basically everybody since 1945 in the West, since World War II, um, has kind of grown up in this bubble where everything you've just articulated is the entirety of what you can think. Um, the trouble is that there, and this actually does relate to the 60s. If you look at the original hippies or flower power or anything of that, there was a genuine sentiment underneath it all, which is that something about this world that's been created since World War II, we're missing something spiritual, community, something authentic. So you get all the memes like the Beatles go to India and kind of pal around with gurus and play the sitar and all this sort of stuff. They go on their gap year and try to kind of need to find
Find
myself, man.
themselves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
find myself, man. Um, but I mean, it's easy to mock, but I do think there was something genuine underneath that, which is to, uh, i.e., find something real, find something that is more than this, what you just described there. Um, and it's a genuine social cohesion, genuine community, feeling like you are bigger than, uh, feeling like you're part of something that's bigger than yourself. Um, Unfortunately, for various different reasons, um, whether it was co-opted by commercial interests or just whatever was in the ether, that is not the direction that the kind of 60s counterculture ultimately ended up going in. And in fact, the boomers, despite all of the rhetoric about them being countercultural, ended up being arguably the most quote unquote normie generation of all time. They put down their sunglasses and peace signs and basically went to work and had 40-year careers, paying a mortgage, working in the office, doing the 9 to 5, watching all the Hollywood movies. I mean, this is ultimately the same people. So, in a way, the dream, when John Lennon said the dream is over, in a way that was taken literally, and they actually became the biggest defenders of this regime that we're talking about. Um, but that feeling that something is missing, I don't think has ever quite gone away, and um, I think young people now still are looking for something to fulfill those other needs that liberalism or liberal democracy, those kind of non-material needs, spiritual needs that are not fulfilled by the life that we have all led. Um, and I mean, it's kind of difficult because I grew up without any particular sort of religion, and I feel like I will never fully lose that. I mean, despite my own best efforts, I'm a child of my time, as are we all, right? So I find it difficult to take the kind of Mary Harrington thing where oh, now I'm a Christian type thing, or it's very difficult for me to take that leap of faith. But still, I think we all recognise that as comfortable and as nice and as well fed as we all are, there's still something that has been lost. And the easiest way to figure this out is to speak to people who grew up in working class neighbourhoods in the 50s and the 60s, like mining towns in Wales or factory towns up north or whatever. People were dirt poor, and yet they have genuinely fond memories of those places they grew up in because they were genuine communities. There was a community. People respected each other. People knew each other. Whereas increasingly we've gone towards the American model of everybody being siloed off in suburbia, basically, or in little, even worse, in a little box in London where you're surrounded by strangers.
That you just dissed my life there.
I'm not having I'm
Exactly
not
how
having a
I'm
go at
living.
your specific life, Nick, but
Literally living in a flat on the seventh floor, surrounded by strange people in London who are of completely different cultures. Yeah, it's exactly. I'm sort of, but I'm full of contradictions. But yeah, very interesting answer. I mean, I've done the same. I've done something different. I've actually sort of unilaterally returning to Christianity, and people do mock me and sort of say, "Oh, they say, oh, I couldn't do it, or that's okay." Your religion. They treat me like I'm suddenly some zealot, some evangelical or something. Whereas I'm actually just the same as them. I'm a cynical Gen X,
Mhm.
technically millennial person, just who's just decided to do it as an act of partly of faith, partly of social responsibility, a kind of mixture. And I've just done it. And I heard Ed Dutton was mocking me about it the other day on one of his guests. I mean, he sent it to me. He wasn't doing it behind my back. And Carl's mocked me about it, and sort of I've tried to get him to be a Christian. So you can sort of mock it, but it's because, like you say, we grew up a certain way. It's hard to completely dispel that and just say, right, I'm a Christian now. Although that said, I did grow up Christian because that was also the furniture when I grew up. You were nominally Christian. We said the Lord's Prayer every day. We sang hymns. We went across to the church. We did the nativity. This was all normal. So we all actually all were Christian, at least in the north where I'm from, in the little village. Your background is slightly different, but we were basically all Christian anyway.
Mhm.
So I'm just going back to it in a sense. But we needed that enveloping cultural Christianity, which we don't have now. That was the key, and that's what it's very hard to recreate. Um, so, lastly, I sometimes ask people how we win the culture war at the end of this podcast, but I feel like A, this whole podcast has been about that, and B, that formulation would be rejected immediately by elite theory. I mean, one thing, since reading your work, I've been sort of wondering what the heck I do, because if we're run by elites who are then replaced by other elites, and the people never have power, and the people really don't affect anything, and that's all an illusion and a delusion, then what on earth can we do? Is it essentially just waiting to see if the next elite aligns more with our values? What do we do?
That's pretty much it. The best we can hope for is for our friends to be in power and not our enemies, and give them. No, I'm just a scholar. I don't have no kind of political affiliations or backing or anything like that. Um, but the reason I put my stuff out there ultimately is so that some of these people who could be in a position to do something about these things could ultimately give us what we all want, which is basically a little like a sensible government that's not going to, empower people who hate us, who are going to just do the basics of internal and external security, who are going to appoint the best people for, the best people for various different jobs and not do kind of quota box ticking exercises. I mean, just basic good governance, wise governance. But unfortunately, we live in a time where that idea of just a slightly more sensible government by people who are wise and benevolent is beyond the purview of most people, to the point where it sounds like an unimaginable pipe dream. But it's not. And see, this is where I think a lot of people get confused with elite theory, because elite theory is very Machiavellian and it seems so cynical. But none of the elite theorists, um, at the end of the day, believed that wise governance was impossible, and neither did Machiavelli. Ultimately, that's all Machiavelli wanted too, was a more sensible and wiser and more benevolent ruler. Um, and in a way, once you get the small problem of democracy and votes and stuff out of the way, the challenge before you gets is clarified. It's clarified. Um, And in the current moment, again, we talked about Elon Musk and how some of these people's views don't exactly align with our own. You're always going to get that. The question is, though, directionally, are they going to be more sensible than what we have now? And really, that's the best we can hope for, I think. Uh, you know, I don't know if that's a white pill or a black pill or what, but it is a
Yeah,
pill.
it's arguably a white pill in one sense, that the elite theorists are taking such a bird's eye view that they see change as just inevitable. It does change to another elite, so we're trapped in it, and one can imagine, oh, we're trapped in this wokeness, we're trapped in neoliberal globalism, whatever you call it, and we can't find a way out. But it wasn't there before. It arrived quite suddenly, or it felt like it did. Anyway, it was a long march through the institutions, but it emerged into our consciousness quite suddenly. But it could go again. It seems, and it also, when you think about books like The Fourth Turning, or you think about history not actually just being a linear progression, it could quite easily go back to something we could suddenly have the death penalty. I mean, if a majority, let's just pick a random example. Not that I'm all about the death penalty, but like if a majority of British people want the death penalty for child murders, terrorist murders, and serial murders, which they do, and it was brought in by a radical leftist guy in the 60s, which it was, the abolition of it was brought in. So why couldn't we, for example, have that? Or just as one random example that came into my head, but it seems to us unfeasible. That thing of like that Blair thing you were saying of that debate's been won. That's we've already had that. But actually, in reality, gaslighting aside, we could suddenly bring in all kinds of things quite quickly that would have seemed impossible. And and he mentioned Elon Musk, him buying X was completely unpredictable, and that's a massive game changer. So, do you agree that actually change could come fairly sort of easily, and in fact, inevitably?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, one of the things of the online right, or what is known as the digital right, is that it's exciting to some people and dangerous to others, is that we put everything back on the table. We so like all those bits of progress that we chirped on about our whole lives. None of them are permanent. Anything could happen, right? Um, and in fact, there are examples of people doing it right now. I mean, again, whether you love him or hate him, if you actually look at what Vladimir Putin is doing in Russia right now, there will be leftists in Russia who are crying about the things that he has done, yet they are happening. And he's got a lot of the public. Apparently, he's got a lot of the public. 75% of Russian support of Putin is doing. Now, that could be a lie. It could be true. But the fact is, he is doing it. He's rewarding his friends and he's punishing his enemies. And a lot of what we have been trying to get people to see, Aaron McIntyre does it in America, I do it here, and various other people do, is to get people to see that our politicians, and especially the Tories in this country and the Republicans in America, don't think like that. When was the last time the Tories rewarded their friends, i.e., their voters, and punished their enemies? They don't. They literally kowtow to their enemies, as we saw with this business with Lee Anderson, and they throw their friends under the bus. And that's going to be one of the reasons why, what was it, 24,000 people who voted for them last time in that one seat didn't vote for them this time. It's because so many people have woken up to the fact that they're just not playing basic politics. Basic
Yeah,
politics, friend and enemy. They're not doing it. So, and basically, regardless of what the Tory party do, what all of us need to do is to try to ensure that whether it's whatever name you give it, it has to be a coalition of people who are going to work in our interests, not the interests of all of the people who seem to hate this place.
but does that come down to the fallacy again of the will of the people? I just realised with my death penalty example, in elite theory, the ruling class don't care at all about your views on anything or polls or anything like that, so they wouldn't care about that. Do they? And why would they even care about the voters, as you just cited?
No, I mean what you could do is you could declare one day. We've had a look at various different things, and we've decided it's in the best interest. We've had a look, for example, at the crime rate of Saudi Arabia, and instances of theft in Saudi Arabia are something like zero point 0.1 per 100,000, which is, you know, basically zero, right? And we figured out that basically the death penalty is good. So we're gonna bring it back, and then after you do that, you can hold a plebiscite, which then the will of the people rubber stamps it. We're going to hold a plebiscite. Now, what's funny about that is that obviously many autocratic regimes pull these sorts of tricks as well. My favorite example is Salazar, the leader of Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
Salazar's election record is incredible because he won every single election that he took part in, and he got 100% of the vote every single time. So he could genuinely say
Legend.
that he was, he had the will of the people. You understand what I'm saying, right? So it's kind of
Yeah, yeah.
like, all right, whatever stuff we need to justify it, we'll make it up afterwards. But basically, death penalty is coming back. God wills it. Whatever.
Right, right. So we could still get our utopia of death penalty for petty theft and no women voting. I'm just like, people who got to the end of this podcast for like 2 hours, then they suddenly like, I agree with most of the things they're saying. It's like, oh, that's the vision they want. Like at the end.
Well, people can argue about exactly what they want, but
Yeah,
one step at a time, maybe. Just need to get the
yeah,
coalition of
yeah.
friends first. So,
Let's get that sorted first, and we'll start with bringing Christianity back. Well, who knows? All right. Well, that is the answer. That was so okay. So it's not completely as hopeless as some might think, but in terms of what we actually do, it does make me wonder. What am I doing? Is it useful what I do, or is it part of the problem? I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. But at least you're trying to get ideas out there and put this into people's heads. So yeah, that's something I'll have to reflect on that myself. Thanks so much for doing the show. Where can people find you?
yeah, I mean, my YouTube channel, Academic Agent, is the the biggest presence I have. I also have a Substack called The Forbidden Texts, which you can find through there. My books, Populist Illusion, Prophets of Doom, you can find them on Amazon. Type my name in, Nima Parvini. Um, Anything else? Those are probably the main
Courses.
those are probably the main ways that you'll find me. I am on Twitter as well as some rat or something, but I wouldn't bother with that.
Okay, well, yeah, definitely buy the Populist Illusion. It's excellent. And what about your courses? Don't you run actual academic courses that you sell?
Yes, at the academic agency, I sell the Trivium, Foundations of Economics, Politics, some of the topics we've talked about covered in those courses, and there are courses by other people as well that I offer on there, and that's actually the main way I make my living now is through people buying those courses. Um, I think over 3,000 people have bought those courses to date. Um, and they will be, I mean, if you write for a living, certainly foundations of writing and foundations of logic and foundations of research, if you're a journalist or whatnot, would, even if you fancy yourself as a great writer, I think they would be of benefit to anybody, people at university. Um, you know, if you just take the trivium, that will inoculate you against a lot of the nonsense that you see because so much of everything, Nick, is emotion. Emotion, and um, one of the things I try to teach people is how to cut through all of that to get to the actual arguments.
Okay, and that's on what's the website? Academic Agency.
It's academic-agency.com, I think. Yeah, .com. So yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Check out those courses. Go to Academic Agent YouTube if you don't already know it. Many of you will. And the Forbidden Text Substack. If you want to follow my Substack, it's nickdixon.substack.com. Speaking of great writers, nickdixon.substack.com. And of course, you can buy me a copy, buymeacoffee.com/nickdixon to keep the lights on, keep these excellent podcasts going. Buymeacoffee.com/nickdixon. Thanks so much to Academic Agent, and we'll be back again next week.